Hi, everyone. I'm Mariangela Maguire, and you're listening to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. Thank you so much for joining me today. So the show's purpose, as I say in the introduction, is to talk about mindfulness. And for the show itself, I hope to be a space in your life where you can bring your attention and awareness to the present moment, maybe relax into this moment, allowing yourself to find places in what I talk about that resonate with your experience as you deepen your understanding of yourself, become a student of your own mind, body, and heart. My topics are intended to support people on their journey towards greater mindfulness, which is bringing attention and awareness to the present moment without judgment. It's a simple sounding goal that can be very difficult to achieve, but its value is that mindfulness practices bring us greater internal peace, and having greater internal peace allows us to be a force for peace in our world. So given that introduction, it might seem strange that my topic today is essentially the case against mindfulness. Here's what prompted that initially. So I was reading a novel called What Are You Going Through by Sigrid Nunez. It's her latest book, and it was an excellent novel if you're looking for something good to read. In an early scene, the narrator has gone to see a lecture at a local college, and she tells us some of what the speaker, whom we later learn is her ex-husband, said during the lecture. How sad to see so many among the most creative and best educated classes, those from whom we might have hoped for inventive solutions, instead embracing personal therapies and pseudo-religious practices that promoted detachment, a focus on the moment, acceptance of one's surroundings as they were, equanimity in the face of worldly cares. Self-care, relieving one's own everyday anxieties, avoiding stress, these had become some of our society's highest goals, he said, higher apparently than the salvation of society itself. The mindfulness rage was just another distraction, he said. Of course we should be stressed, he said. We should be utterly consumed with dread. Mindful meditation might help a person face drowning with equanimity, but it would do absolutely nothing to right the Titanic, he said. It wasn't individual efforts to achieve inner peace. It wasn't a compassionate attitude towards others that might have led to timely preventive action, but rather a collective, fanatical, over-the-top obsession with impending doom. I don't think prior to the time I read that passage in Nunez's book that I had read such an incisive and full-throated criticism of mindfulness. It really did catch me up short, and there's a reason for that too. I disagree with the foundation of the character's perspective, but I know there's real value in taking it seriously enough to interrogate it. It turns out, you see, that long before I was a college professor or a life coach, I was a college debater. It was the most powerful educational experience of my life because it taught me how to put critical thinking into practice. So when I read that passage in Nunez's novel, I realized that in the years I've been practicing mindfulness, I haven't spent much time reading critiques of it. I've exercised critical thinking skill, I believe, by evaluating what I read about mindfulness. I've rejected some perspectives and embraced others. But this passage reminded me of the importance of examining and taking seriously perspectives that are deeply critical of beliefs that I hold dear. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to talk about what I have identified through my reading as 5 primary and overlapping criticisms of mindfulness. And I'm going to try to respond to them mindfully, as well as describe my experience, the challenge of allowing these ideas to become part of my own experience. So before I discuss those 5 primary criticisms that I've noticed, let's breathe, because I know I could use that after all that reading and in anticipation of talking about difficult ideas. So we're going to do something slightly different today. It'll be a little bit easier to do if you're standing up, but I think you can do it sitting down. So we're going to inhale and raise our hands over our head. And then when we exhale, we're going to bring our hands together kind of in front of our face. If you've ever had a French press coffee, think of it as pressing down that lever, that button on the top of the French press, but just basically intertwining your fingers and pushing down. Okay, so we're going to do that 3 times. And we bring attention to our breathing because it brings focus and clarity and calmness. And that's always those are always good things. So let's try this out. First, inhale, hands together, exhale down. Third time. Okay. I always feel a little bit more relaxed after we do that, whatever the breathing exercises that we try. This one I learned in my yoga class the other day. So here's what I think are the 5, or what I've noticed are the 5 common, and as I say, interrelated critical responses to mindfulness. So the first is that mindfulness is a commodity. It's simply something that has been packaged and sold through books, podcasts, webinars, retreats, phone apps, right? The modern version of it is designed to do nothing more, than make a buck. The second criticism is that it's Buddhism light, that L-I-T-E light. It's detached from the serious teachings of Buddhism to make it simple and digestible to a mass audience, but in doing so, it has really lost track of the serious principles and practices behind it. The third criticism you often see is that its benefits are overstated, and that they're not unique to mindfulness, that the same kinds of benefits can be obtained through other means. The fourth is that it's a tool of neoliberalism, right? It makes people passive and complacent and willing to accept whatever their bosses ask of them. And then the fifth is that it's not only teaching passivity and complacence, but that it actually gives people an excuse for not being politically active, and that it can be an expression, therefore, of white privilege. So these are the 5 criticisms that I have seen in the reading that I've been doing about this topic. As I say, they're interrelated, and we're going to talk about each one in turn. And so Jacob, if it's okay with you, we're going to go a little bit early to a break so that we can kind of start off cleanly. So you're listening to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. And when we come back, we'll talk about some of the common criticisms of mindfulness meditation. We'll be right back. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. I'm Mariangela Maguire, and although the purpose of the show is to help people on their mindfulness journey, today's conversation is whether or not mindfulness is actually a scam. And of course, I did it on April 1st because I know there's a little bit of an April Fool's joke embedded in that. I think mindfulness is a really great thing, but I also think that bringing critical thinking skills to any belief system that we have is very valuable. I don't think that inherently undermines the belief. In fact, for many people, I think bringing that critical thinking perspective and skills and knowledge to a belief system strengthens beliefs. So we're talking today about 5 interrelated criticisms that you can see in popular literature and culture, journalism, etc., about mindfulness, as particularly as it's expressed and practiced, I would say, in the United States and throughout popular culture. So the first one is that it's a commodity, packaged and sold through books and podcasts, webinars, retreats, and apps on your phone. The modern version of it, this critique suggests, is simply designed to make a buck. And you know what? It's true that there are teachings about mindfulness all around us. You can pay almost anything to learn about mindfulness, whether it's through a retreat or a webinar. You can buy, there's probably hundreds of books in English on the topic. It's probably also true that there are people selling those books or webinars who are more interested in creating material wealth for themselves than helping others improve their lives. And unfortunately, while this phenomenon is happening within and in a way that promotes mindfulness, it certainly happens in a lot of belief systems, but that doesn't excuse the fact that it does exist. And I would argue kind of in a simple way that the most important thing we can bring then to that is that critical thinking perspective. We'll talk more later about what we can do when we're faced with this mindfulness in our culture. So the second critique is that it's Buddhism light, right? It's detached from the serious teachings of Buddhism to make it simple and digestible to a larger audience. And given the incredible proliferation of materials about mindfulness, it's really not surprising that there are many different versions of it, that there are different ways of explaining and exploring it, and not all of them have the same grounding in Buddhism or in the same aspects of Buddhism, because Buddhism, like most belief systems, whether it's political or religious, cultural, has many different strands. It's been exported across continents and over time. And like many belief systems, it has adherents who aim to develop a practice that is as close as possible to its origins. And at the same time, it has adherents who believe it's more important to make its central tenets accessible to the widest possible audience, with the idea that they believe that will do the most good. So again, this idea of how closely mindfulness meditation adheres to particular practices of Buddhist religion and philosophy, that's not unique to that particular belief system, that there are different strands of it and that there are conflicts within the Buddhist community about these kind of contemporary practices. But again, that doesn't excuse people exploiting those differences. And it does give us reason to at least be aware that those differences exist. That can be part of our education about mindfulness. The third consideration or critique is that it's simply that people who write about mindfulness meditation in a very positive way and really promote it, that they overstate its benefits, and that they suggest or imply that the benefits are unique to mindfulness meditation. And a really great person to read on this topic is Barbara Ehrenreich. And you may know her name from a lot of other books that she's written, where she does a really deep interrogation of various cultural phenomena and practices. So she wrote a book recently, I think it was published in 2020, called Natural Causes. And she has a whole chapter on mindfulness. There's also an essay version of that you can find in a magazine whose name I have just forgotten. But she talks about mindfulness as simply another strategy in the wellness empire. And that's the real topic of the book, is what she calls the wellness empire. And that it's designed, in fact, this empire to give us the illusion of control, which is kind of interesting because I think mindfulness meditators and certainly Buddhists don't really believe that control is possible, that, a deep awareness of the world as it exists around us and its impermanence is actually a lesson in the fact that control is an illusion. But I think she's talking about, if you read her work, she's clearly attacking or interrogating what people might call the mindfulness meditation light, L-I-T-E, not just Buddhism light, but a light version of mindfulness meditation. And she specifically mentions that people who talk about and promote mindfulness meditation often say that it fosters neuroplasticity, or the capacity for our brains to develop, to continue to develop, to change, for us to, they sort of use the phrase sculpting our brains, to say how it can change in positive ways over time. And Ehrenreich simply argues that this claim is wildly overstated, and that while the brain does indeed change over time, meditation is not the only path to that level of neuroplasticity. That other things like simply being calm or taking SSRIs or going into therapy, that those two might produce those same kinds of outcomes. So that's number 3. Number 4 is that mindfulness meditation is actually a tool of neoliberalism, right? It's intended to make people passive and complacent and willing to accept whatever their bosses ask of them. And I put that in the context of bosses because to answer that question, why would people believe this? Why would people associate kind of neoliberalism with mindfulness meditation? Well, first, it's because there have been a lot of multinational businesses, particularly in the tech industry, that have incorporated mindfulness practices into corporate wellness programs. And this too is part of Aaron Reich's critique. The presence of meditation rooms, of mindfulness retreats, of meditation webinars, of making coaching accessible to employees. All of those are strategies for encouraging employees to practice mindfulness. And that in itself has aroused suspicion because we can see from a really just even a cursory glance at contemporary corporate America that big business does nothing that does not contribute to its bottom line, to executive pay, and to shareholder earnings. So it's inconceivable to many that a program sponsored by an employer has personal liberation as its goal, even though that is in fact the stated goal of something, of certainly of Buddhism, of liberation, freedom, and also from mindfulness meditation. And in itself, I would argue, I don't think that that invalidates mindfulness, but it does, again, ask us to be aware as consumers and as employees. And then finally, it not only teaches passivity and complacence, but it gives people an excuse for not being politically active. And it can be an expression, in fact, of white privilege, because mindfulness meditation, one kind of simplistic way to talk about it is that, what's going to happen is going to happen, right? That we need to learn how to love what is. We need to focus on and practice acceptance. And that can feel, I think, and I've certainly thought about this quite a bit because it is very troubling to me that ask myself that question in promoting mindfulness meditation in my own life and in that of my clients and people who listen to the podcast. Am I encouraging them to be not only passive and complacent in their personal lives, but to take a very passive, accepting stand of whatever's going on in the larger culture, and to ignore systems of oppression as just kind of a big shrug, oh, well, that's just the way things are unfolding, and there's nothing I can do about it. So you might guess, if you've listened to the show before, that I don't think that all of these critiques are legitimate, but I do think that they're worth thinking about because I think they raise important questions, and that a belief system that goes uninterrogated is not very strong. I said that kind of softly earlier, but I would say it more strongly now. I think in the absence of hard questions, we don't really know what we believe because we haven't maybe tested it. So now I want to talk about kind of 4 responses I have and things I want us to think about and encourage people to think about if they are pursuing and learning more about mindfulness meditation and incorporating it into their own life. So one would be to really focus on that idea of critical thinking, right? Just Google the phrase. What is critical thinking really about? It's about understanding evidence. It's about understanding information and evaluating information. And so if we think about that in terms of something like incorporating a new belief system like mindfulness into our lives, we could ask ourselves a series of questions. For instance, what level of scientific support do I need in order to find something useful or practical in my life or meaningful, right? Am I even looking for scientific support? But if it exists, what critical thinking skills can I bring to it? So this kind of goes to that question of, are some of these claims about meditation overstated? You can look at some of the research. There's quite a bit of it out there, but not everything has really been examined closely. And you'll see evidence on both sides that the benefits are real, but they're not unique, is kind of a thing that you're going to see a lot of, but the benefits, but there is some scientific evidence. But the question is, what do you need? What is important to you in that question? You could ask yourself, what would an evidence-based assessment look like? For instance, a lot of school districts have incorporated mindfulness meditation into the daily practice of their students. And you could look at something like reports or incidents of bad behavior, what's maybe called bad behavior or acting out or whatever phrase we might use to describe that. Has there been any correlation? Wouldn't you want to use causation? That might be too strong, but can you correlate schools using mindfulness practices with lower rates of students getting sent to the principal's office, right? Are students better able to attend to their activities, to learning? That there are a lot of different ways that you might look for evidence, but wanting to know what would be persuasive to me. What do I need to know? And then those questions, I think, are really important in the context of two larger questions. One is, what results am I looking for? Right? When I incorporate a new practice into my life, what am I hoping to gain from it? And do I need guarantees? Right? And do I believe that anything is a panacea? I think that's one of the things that critics really are implying, if not suggesting outright, is that, and I think this is probably a critique of any belief system that suggests that we could be at more peace and more happiness in our lives, is that it might be something that says, this is a panacea, this is a cure-all, this is going to make everything okay. I personally don't believe in panaceas. So I didn't bring that expectation or that need to mindfulness meditation when I first started taking up that practice. So that's the first set of questions that I think are important to talk about in relationship to mindfulness meditation, if it's something you're incorporating into your life. Jacob, are we due for another break? Am I wrong about that? Okay, then I'm going to do the second one. Okay, so the second one, and this is another series of questions, is a question of agency. Like, what is my role in this? And I think we all probably are more passive consumers of information than we realize. I tend to think of myself as not that, it's that old college debater thing. But I really want to promote that question of agency, of what can I bring to it? What activity of mine can I bring to this? So I want to ask, what is my role in this? And for me, this is, if I'm encouraging others to follow a particular belief practice, that increases my responsibility to know the value of it and what it is I'm encouraging others to do. I want to ask, is it just for me, right? Because I get to spend my time and money as I want to, and maybe, in general, there's an industry that is making a buck off of denigrating others' beliefs, and that should be called into question too. It's kind of a funny thing, isn't it? There are people accusing mindfulness meditation practitioners of only being out to make a buck, but sometimes those people are writing books that is their livelihood too, right? So it's very easy to be critical of everybody involved. But I would say I just want to bring consciousness to it, to say, what's really going on here? I want to ask myself, who benefits from my beliefs? Do I benefit? Yes. Does my partner benefit? I think so. Do my clients? Probably. But how does that change in what matters then if my employer benefits? I don't have an employer, but I used to. What if my employer benefits from my belief systems? What does that mean? Does that mean that I'm in a passive, complacent place? Or can I allow myself to bring my good, strong, critical thinking skills to a moment and say, I'm going to take advantage of these opportunities and I'm still going to strive for liberation. And one of the things that's going to happen because of that is I may start to question my employer. I may start to question the choices I've made in terms of career. I may bring not only a critical thinking attitude towards mindfulness meditation, but to my life in general, to my world in general. And there is risk in that, and there is challenge in that. And so I think that's worth, when we incorporate a belief system, to really ask, who benefits from my beliefs? Who's asking me to do this? To what end? So when we come back, we're going to talk about, I think, these even broader and tougher issues, which is about, does mindfulness meditation encourage passivity, acceptance of privilege, acceptance of the status quo? So you're listening to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio, and we'll be right back after the break. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. I'm Mariangela Maguire, and today we are talking about mindfulness in a particular way, which is we're talking about some of the popular critiques of mindfulness practices. And what we've noticed is, or what I've noticed in the reading that I've done, is that some of the critique revolves around how commercialized it's become. And I think there's, the evidence of that is just overwhelming. There are so many things you could spend money on in order to learn more about practicing mindfulness. But I do want to mention that you could listen to my show for free, but also there are other people with much deeper knowledge about these things who do offer their practices and their words and insights for free. People like Tara Brach and Jonathan Faust really deep and helpful practical thinkers on these subjects. And Jack Kornfield, you Google them. Their wisdom is freely offered. You can make a donation, but you don't have to. And so I think it's a reasonable critique. You don't want people to buy things just to be buying it and not really get anything out of it, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the spirit of their Buddhist practices, people like Kornfield and Brock and Faust, Ruth King and others, they make a lot of their work very, very accessible, not only in terms of how they talk about it, but that it is freely offered. And so it is actually not essential to spend money in order to learn more about mindfulness. So that's kind of the one side, that it's really hucksterism, people out to make a buck. I think another even more important aspect of this critique is that somehow mindfulness meditation in particular really encourages passivity, because let's face it, there are words like acceptance really at the heart of mindfulness meditation. And so I think that's a critique worth exploring, right? So it may not cause the problems that we're talking about, sort of the cultural, structural problems, but we could ask, does mindfulness do anything to address them? Nobody's saying that mindfulness causes racism, but does it do anything to address it? And as a white woman with class privilege, I would say what it has helped me do is know what my habits of mind are. And I think that's critically important, especially because, I think of myself as a non-racist, as an egalitarian, but there are loads of useful critiques of people in my kind of position who really function or perceive the world as they are white saviors, right? Ready to change structures, but unwilling to change the way they interact with other people in their own lives. So for me, my perspective is that it's through a deep attention to my habits of mind and staying in my discomfort when it arises, where I can observe the deeply embedded mental habits of white supremacy and classism that I possess. And I think in those moments, three kind of interrelated things can happen that can be useful. Because I don't think I'm effective at helping change unless I'm in a clear and aware place when I do it. That's the problem with the white savior complex, is that they're sort of unaware of what they're doing and how they may be silencing people through their desire to kind of be knights in shining armor. So when I'm in that place of my discomfort and recognizing my own habits of mind that are pervaded by, say, classism or racism, I can see where I have been unaware of places where I might be wielding my privilege. And find ways to yield it, in fact. I can sit with that discomfort and gain greater insight into it rather than simply denying its truth. So, when I say I can gain greater insight, you might think, well, that's just navel gazing. But I think the alternative too often is denying it and saying, no, that can't be true of me because look, I give money to the NAACP. And so while I want to remain compassionate towards myself when I recognize those places, I also then am in a place where I can recognize how I might change my behavior, how I need to change my behavior. Second, I can see beyond my individual habits when I sit with that discomfort. And I can notice that those habits of mine come from somewhere, right? I didn't invent them. That doesn't excuse my enacting them and operationalizing them, but I didn't invent them, and that's important to know, because then I can see how those behaviors are reinforced and rewarded by the social structures in which I exist. And when I talk about this, I always think of the experience I've had so many times in a grocery store. You go up to a meat counter or maybe a bakery where you place in the store where there's a counter and staff on the other side, and you take a number or not, but you are kind of vying to be recognized by the people who work there to see who's next in line. And especially as I've gotten older, I've noticed this happen more and more. A lot of people talk about how you become more invisible as you get older, sometimes, but I think my age, my gray hair, and my whiteness and femaleness as well, I think I look like a Karen, right, shopper. And so many times I'm standing there and the other person standing who's been there before me is African American, and invariably, it seems, the staff member comes directly to me. And I've thought about this a lot because it's happened so often. And of course I yield to the other person. But what worries me about it is that I don't know what the staff member really thinks has happened there. I don't know if they didn't see the Black person standing next to me. I don't know if they assumed that that person came first and really believed I was there, that I was there first. But what I worry about is that they assume that I'm that kind of person who expects to be served next. And to me, that's one of those places where I am sort of handed my white privilege and classism on a little silver platter and said, here you go, take it if you want. And so, great, I notice it when it happens there. But what are the places where I'm not noticing it? Where I'm not noticing it? I know that's happening too. And so trying to acknowledge that and to be more comfortable with the discomfort, so that I sit with it rather than deny it and push it away. And I learn from it. And I learn about how my privilege in the world really functions and what I can do about it. So, and I can then come to understand that, simply being kind and letting, somebody else telling the truth right in front of in the meat counter and saying, no, I'm not next, she's next, right? That's all well and good. But it doesn't in itself dismantle the social structures that gave me that unearned privilege and that oppress others. I can act from that knowledge then far more effectively because now I have the firsthand experience, not only of knowing that I was in a place of ignorance, but that I can move to a place of awareness. And from awareness, I can move to a place of enacting change. And then finally, I can ask myself this difficult question that I find very difficult. So can I practice mindfulness meditation? And in doing so, relieve some of my own suffering that I experience in everyday life and still recognize that there is suffering in the world, even in my own life, like misogyny or homophobia, and that it's systemic. Of course, the answer for me is yes, because I like evidence and I can notice my own relief at mindfulness meditation and the relief it brings me in my life. And I can still read government reports or sociological studies or analyses from think tanks that demonstrate over and over again the depth and the breadth of structural unfairness that exists in the world. And I can believe that those who are most disadvantaged by such structures also gain greater inner peace through mindfulness practices. And that those practices, and for a person who is structurally disadvantaged to practice mindfulness, is not a denial of the existence of those structures. And it doesn't excuse us or tell us that we don't need to dismantle them. And that's my work to do as well, if not primarily, since I'm the beneficiary of those structures. But I think I really genuinely believe that we all deserve some level of inner peace. And I think, and someone I think like Ruth King has really articulated this very well to talk about, even in the face of living in an incredibly unfair system, I can be at peace, or she can be at peace. And there's value in that. That doesn't alleviate the need for social change. And I was going back to that quote from the Nunez novel, where the lecturer says, it wasn't individual efforts to achieve inner peace. It wasn't a compassionate attitude towards others that might have led to timely preventive action on the Titanic, but rather a collective fanatical over-the-top obsession with impending doom. And I just think that's not true in so many ways. First of all, I don't think the people on the Titanic who were failing because they were practicing mindfulness. And I don't think they were actually practicing mindfulness, right? And I think, in fact, if you watch the movies or read the books about it, there wasn't a whole lot of compassionate attitude towards others. That was, in fact, part of the problem, that the Titanic, who died on the Titanic, crew members died. The people in the lower classes died. They were trapped, right? A lot of the rich people got off the boat. That's kind of the point of some of the stories that you read about the Titanic, right? They, in fact, did not have a compassionate attitude towards others. And that is, in fact, part of what led to the failure of preventative action, right? And if I imagine a collective, fanatical, over-the-top obsession with impending doom, I just picture the people, and again, seeing this in the movies, right, who were the upper-class men putting on women's clothes in order to get into a lifeboat. That was a person who had a fanatical, over-the-top obsession with impending doom and his own survival. So yeah, I didn't like that quote that much, but it was helpful and got me to thinking about things. So I also want to mention then that reading these critiques of mindfulness was a great opportunity to practice mindfulness, right? I noticed when I felt anxious as I approached each text and as I explored the feeling of realizing that how afraid I felt, right? Am I stupid? Did I miss something obvious? Is there a fatal flaw in this? And boy, I don't like that feeling of maybe I'm stupid. I noticed I felt defensive at times and an urge to respond with, kind of return fire. That like, you accuse us of cherry picking the mindfulness literature, but that's what you're doing too. Or you're exaggerating the claims of exaggeration, right? All of that. You get really caught up in that. And at places I felt kind of excited. It reminded me of being back in graduate school where there's that constant back and forth of claims and counterclaims. There's a very lively debate among those who practice Buddhism and mindfulness meditation about their roots, about its appropriate use, about authenticity. And I can imagine, based on my own previous life in higher education, that it could be pretty great and exciting, energizing to participate in those discussions. Although some of them were kind of rough. They're kind of rough on each other. But I also noticed my relief that I don't have to engage at that level. I do not claim to be a mindfulness meditation expert. I'm simply a person on a journey, and I'm grateful for what I've read, for who I've listened to, for what I've learned along the way, what I've been able to incorporate into my own life, and the value that I've seen of that. I don't need to engage at that level, except maybe to have this conversation today to say, hey, what are the limitations of what we call mindfulness meditation? So we're going to wrap up after this last break to talk a little bit more, maybe in concrete ways, about what we can do with this criticism and these ideas and what it means for belief systems in general. So you're listening to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio, and we'll be right back after the break. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. Thanks for joining me today. So I took a little bit different tack today. I wanted to talk about some of the criticisms that we see in popular culture about mindfulness meditation. And I'm doing that in part because I had realized that despite kind of a lifetime of learning to use and promoting critical thinking skills, that I really haven't brought that to bear too much on mindfulness meditation. I'll be honest, I don't read super widely within the range of things that are available because I have come to notice pretty quickly what kinds of authors really engage me intellectually and on a personal level. And so I don't want, I just don't want to. I don't want to. Well, I'm going to come back to this idea in a few minutes of I don't want to just keep reading about it, and the difference between kind of seeking that kind of information versus practicing. So, but I haven't really engaged the critique, so I decided to do that. And in particular, I was reading Barbara Ehrenreich, who I think is so insightful and incisive in her critiques of popular culture and other aspects of culture. But it's one, just as there are things about mindfulness meditation and its benefits that are not unique, criticizing something that's popular in culture is not a particularly unique thing to do either. But it's not a bad thing to do, because I think it's the kind of activity that can promote and encourage us to bring our critical thinking skills to bear on any belief system. When I think about all the ideas, ideologies, belief systems that I've encountered in my life, it occurs to me that it's always possible to make a series of similar arguments against them, right? Whether it's a political perspective, a philosophical or religious belief system, or any of the 1,000 guiding principles one might see as a way of organizing one's life. It's very likely that someone could say of the particular way that you are incorporating those principles into your life, that your way doesn't respect the tradition from which these principles emerged, right? Doesn't adhere to the tradition appropriately. They might say that the science you're using to back up your convictions is unsettled or incomplete or poorly done. They might say that the version of those principles you follow is an example of cultural appropriation that's watered down and it's turned into nothing more than a commodity. They might tell you that the freedom you think those principles help you achieve is really just another way for capitalism or the government or Western culture to buy your soul. And you know what? They'd be right, because there is no perfect belief system. Belief systems are created by humans, and humans are imperfect. And even the most sincerely developed set of guiding principles is vulnerable to those who would distort it, try to get rich from it, or use it in ways to manipulate and oppress others. So it's up to each of us, right? As we encounter a set of principles that might seem to have the potential to improve our lives, to ask ourselves a lot of questions about the system of beliefs, but not just about the system, but about why we're seeking such a system. What do we hope to accomplish by bringing a set of ideas and practices into our daily life? How will it change our lives? What will the impact be on how we spend our precious time and energy? And with whom will it put us in conversation? So there are two quotes that I've been looking at that I think have helped me think about this in relationship to today's topic. You know, we can sometimes, when we have deeply held, closely held, beloved beliefs, we want to sometimes avert our eyes from the criticisms that are all around that belief system. Bo Mi Choi wrote an essay called 5 Drinkable Remedies for the 5 Hindrances. So he's a Buddhist meditation practitioner and teacher. But here's what he wrote about aversion. So, or averting our eyes. This is about aversion, and I would put it in the context of averting our eyes from that which challenges our beliefs. He writes, in the throes of aversion, we tend to one-sidedly focus on what is unpleasant and irritating, rather than look at the situation from a more global and balanced perspective. The traditional counteraction to aversion is loving kindness practice, which broadens our view of things. So instead of really being aware of what's unpleasant and irritating, and then avert our eyes from it, how can we have that more global and balanced perspective to say, hey, you know, there are parts of this critique, for instance, of mindfulness meditation that are worth acknowledging, that are worth bringing into our practice to say, am I falling victim to this commodification? What do I need to learn more about these practices in terms of their history and cultural background and origin in order to, if not change my practice, at least have a deeper appreciation for where they come from? And what am I being bought and sold, whether it's as an employee or as a consumer? And especially that question of kind of privilege and passivity. Am I more passive in relationship to what I think is going on in our culture because I'm moved into this place of acceptance? Is that what's really happening for me? So I think those questions, instead of averting our eyes from them, but bringing them into our practice, can be very helpful. And, you know, the opposite kind of aversion or kind of pushing things away is grasping. And that's another way that we might respond to deeply held beliefs when there's challenge to them, is just grasp onto them. And so Khentrul Rinpoche in Unity and Indifference says, adopting a mind that is free from grasping is a direct antidote to a narrow and fixed perspective. So, you know, the silly thing is, you can have a belief system that encourages you to be open, right, and accepting, and you can grasp so tightly onto that belief system that you will not tolerate any kinds of critiques of it, right? In other words, I can have this belief system that says be open, and I can be very narrow and fixed in my perspective and holding on to that belief system. So again, how do we live in that discomfort of saying, is that what's happening for me? Am I unwilling to let go a little and say, this is not a perfect belief system, and there are ways that it might be practiced that I don't really agree with. And then the final thing I want to mention about this is, and I say this because, you know, there is so much commodification of it, and I don't think that in itself is, it's not unique, nothing I can do about it in a sense, because it's just, I think it's inevitable. When people see a way to make a buck, some people are going to do that, and some of what's being sold is good and useful. But one of the pieces of interrogation I wanted to bring into my own practice is to say, am I avoiding practicing the difficult work, the uncomfortable work of practicing mindfulness? Because if I practice it closely, with close attention every day, I will find myself in some difficult places. I will find places where I am uncomfortable, where I am sad, where I am grieving various things, where I am mad at myself perhaps, and really have to struggle to find a place of compassion towards myself or the world. So am I avoiding all that discomfort by buying another book, by listening to another podcast, to going to another webinar, to finding another retreat, right? Am I always seeking more information instead of sitting down with the practice itself and practicing? And it's, we live in a consumer culture that really encourages that kind of buy stuff, buy stuff, buy stuff. And if you buy enough stuff, whether it's clothes or food or pornography or mindfulness meditation seminars, it's going to somehow fill that hole inside of us. And we all know that's not true, but it can be really hard to recognize that and to, instead of filling that hole with more stuff, try to fill it with the practice itself. And even though it will bring us into uncomfortable places. And on that happy note, I would say that's kind of what I do. That's my work with clients, is being, I would say, a gentle guide and a good listener as they find their way into some of those uncomfortable places, and bringing, helping them find a place of compassion towards themselves so that they can live through that discomfort and they can get to the other side of that discomfort in a way that is empowering for them, that they can be an agent, an actor in their own life, to make changes that they want to make, even in the face of knowing that all is impermanent and that we can ideally love what is, but loving what is not the same as never changing what is, and of never rethinking our relationship to what is. So I'm Mariangela Maguire, and you're listening to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. If you'd like to get in contact with me, you can go to my website, which is maguirelifecoach.com. You can email me at mariangelamaguire@gmail.com. And first conversation's always complimentary. We'll talk about what you want to achieve, and we'll talk about my methods. We'll have a session and you'll decide if this is going to work for you. So until next week, I hope that you will continue to be curious about your mind, use those critical thinking skills to examine the belief systems in your own life, and above all, be kind to yourself. So thank you so much for listening to Nothing But Now today on Transformation Talk Radio, and I hope you'll join me next week. You've been listening to Nothing But Now, Mindful Living with Dr. Mariangela Maguire on Transformation Talk Radio. Join me next time as we continue to practice mindfulness and challenge ourselves to change. If you'd like to find out more about my work or contact me, please go to my website, maguirelifecoach.com. That's maguirelifecoach.com. See you next time.
The music for Nothing But Now was created by Salt Theory.